Hello, I'm Richard Murphy and I want to talk about inflation. This is the fourth in a series of videos, we'll put the links to the other one below this one, about how the world has changed since money came off the gold standard 50 years ago, 1971, and what that has meant for the way in which, well, the government creates money, how it gets value, and of course eventually what that means for inflation. But this means we need to discuss what are the causes of inflation. Now, inflation is a general fall in the value of money compared to real goods and services, meaning that those real goods and services cost more in relation to money. Why does that happen? And there are, I think, four good reasons for this, and I want to mention examples in each case. The first reason why there can be a collapse in the value of money is because a government has to make settlement of debts that it can't afford to pay. The perfect example of this was Germany after the First World War, when the Weimar Republic had to make payments, basically in gold, to the victorious allies, France, the UK, USA, for reparations for the costs of the war. Now, Germany simply could not afford to make those payments. It hadn't got enough gold to make the payments because it couldn't generate enough income within its economy to earn that by exporting. The consequence was that all the gold it had was pouring out of the country. In an era when gold backed the value of money, Germany had to start issuing paper money. That paper money was realized to be virtually worthless because there was no asset backing for it. At a time when asset backing for money was essential, the modern era of promises to pay did not stand. And as a consequence, people thought that money was worthless, and it proved that it was. But it was the fact they had to pay the debts in a currency other than their own, effectively gold, which was convertible into dollars and francs and pounds, that brought down the value of currency inside Germany. The answer is never owe money in a currency that is not your own, and you won't get that type of inflation. The second type of inflation is when there are too few resources in an economy and too much money chasing them. Now, there's an example of this, and it's called Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, we did, of course, have President Robert Mugabe, who decided, for his own political reasons, to reform agriculture. His agricultural reforms, over 30 years ago now, basically destroyed the food supply in Zimbabwe. He didn't like the white-owned farms, but the white-owned farms delivered food. He changed the ownership of the replacement farms because they were badly managed, did not sustain the food supply. The money was still being created, but there was insufficient food available, and hyperinflation resulted. So, in the case of Zimbabwe, the problem was too much money created by the government to try and solve a problem when there were too few literal resources on the ground to be bought, with the result that inflation resulted. The lesson is, make sure you get the fundamentals of your economy right, manage the supply chains. The third way in which inflation can be created, which often results in a hyperinflationary environment, is the one that we see in Venezuela. What happened in Venezuela? Well, there was effectively economic warfare. Let's be blunt about this. The US don't much like Venezuela. So although Venezuela was selling oil in dollars, the US was placing sanctions on Venezuela with regard to economic activity, letting the dollars flow within its own economy and letting the dollars flowing within Venezuela undermine the value of the local currency to the point that it was not seen as a credible alternative to those dollars, and therefore collapsed in value in comparison to them, and therefore collapsed in value with regard to the price of local commodities, and as a consequence, hyperinflation resulted in Venezuela. So, three reasons why hyperinflation can happen. Whenever you hear somebody say, oh, governments can't print money because you'll end up with Weimar, Zimbabwe or Venezuela, actually there's a reason why those places collapsed, and it wasn't because of the printing of money. It was because of the foreign debts, because of the collapse of agriculture, and because of economic warfare in each of those three cases. Now, those things are exceptionally rare. In other words, government printing money does not create that situation. Other external factors do. And that is not the consequence of money printing. Money printing might be the consequence of them, but it's not the consequence of money printing. So there is no way on earth that the argument that inflation is created by printing money alone, that we will end up in those situations, is true for, well, virtually any other country in the world at the moment. I mean, there are other economic warfares going on. There are other special circumstances, for example, Lebanon, where there is a collapsed economy because of so many stresses within that place. But overall, the chance for replication of one of those three situations is low. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there couldn't be inflation in a country. There can be inflation in any country because a government overheats the economy by trying to spend too much into it when there are insufficient resources available for it to buy. Now, that is a variation, let's be clear, on the Zimbabwe theme, but without the government having, first of all, undermined the supply chain by making its own reforms that make it virtually impossible for demand to be met. If we were in the UK, for example, to have a government that decided it wanted to substantially expand the education sector, substantially expand the NHS, and substantially expand the number of people it wants to employ on a Green New Deal, and it did nothing to constrain the level of private sector activity in the UK economy, which would otherwise carry on as normal, we will end up with the government's new spending trying to compete for people who are already in employment in the private sector. Wages will go up because there will be too much money chasing a fixed pool of labour at a price which they suddenly discover actually can be beaten by moving job. So the government, if it wants to expand its activity, has to increase taxes on the private sector to reduce demand for private sector activity, to expand the pool of resources available to it so it can spend more. Now, notice that the issue is in the underlying economy. This takes us back to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe got everything wrong. It destroyed the supply chain. Here we need to reorganize the supply chain. A government that wants to spend more on socially desirable activities, which is near full employment, has got to constrain the activity of the private sector because it believes the public sector can do something more useful. For example, it might believe the public sector can constrain the impacts of climate change and the private sector is exaggerating the impact of climate change and therefore needs to strike a new balance between the two. Tax is the mechanism for doing that. It isn't there to control inflation as such, it's actually to make the space for the extra government spending. But that space has to be created to prevent inflation arising as a consequence of that extra spend. And the role of tax is to suppress the private sector demand to create the room for the extra public sector spending, which will then have the resources to buy. People, in other words, will be looking for jobs in the public sector because the amount of demand in the private sector will have fallen, and the result is that then the government can spend more without inflation arising. Now, this is the difference between a managed modern economy with clearly stated objectives and plans to fulfill them, and the type of economy which Weimar Republic, Venezuela and Zimbabwe had, where each of those three was totally out of control, largely for reasons beyond their control, let's be blunt, imposed by others to a very great degree, Zimbabwe accepted perhaps. But the point is, management is key to this. Inflation need not happen because a government wants to spend more. It wants to spend more by creating more money. It doesn't have to happen if the resources are available for it to buy, and tax is the fundamental balancing figure in that equation to make sure that the actual resources the government needs can be bought at a price that it can afford to pay, and price stability is maintained. That's not very straightforward, but I hope it's comprehensible, and it finishes this mini-series around money and inflation. Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in what I've been saying in this video, please subscribe. There is a button below the viewing screen. If you're interested in what I have to say on Twitter, I'm at Richard J. Murphy on that medium. If you want to look at my blog, that's taxresearch.org.uk. And we have a Facebook page as well, Richard J. Murphy. So one of those things will get you more information on what this video series is about, and I hope I'll see you again soon.